What is up, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the Camera and Videography Workshop. I am once again your host. My name is Luis, also known as Mr. Camera Junkie, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about shutter speed versus flicker rate. I know some of you might have gotten some information that had a different title, but that title really didn't have any actual substance because changing your ISO values compared to your shutter speed will still lead to flicker no matter what ISO range you're in. But with that being said, today we are going to be talking about shutter speed versus flicker rate and what that is, how to mitigate it, how to get rid of it, or how to work around it. So as always, I'd like to thank you for taking the time and hanging out here with us as we're going to go over and learn some things. And some of the things that we're going to be talking about today is shutter speed / shutter angle, what they are exactly and how similar or in the differences that they are there, motion blur, exposure control, frame rate, flicker source, frequency matching, and flicker reduction techniques and things that you can do to kind of take care of this in either your photography or videography, but mostly in the video like we're doing here. So let's get right into it. First off, let's go ahead and see who's here. Say what's up. We have Marcio's in the house. We also have Carol saying what's up to the fam. We have Mr. Moderator Paul, and thank you. Actually, I'm apologizing for yesterday's abrupt ending. I actually hit the kill program button, the KP or Keith Pelzer button, on accident. I removed it from my stream deck today, so nothing like that will happen. But just for those of you who were here, that's a great way to maintain and retain or keep retention in your videos all the way to the end when you could just abrupt so fast without saying goodbye. But we're not going to do that today. We're going to have a smooth landing, but we're going to be getting into it. We have Stefan also here. Ennis. We have George saying hello. Neil saying evening to all. Says okay, love the view of the whole studio. That's my my behind the scenes cam, and if you saw the diagram, it's basically just an iPhone XR that I have hovering above to give that angle and kind of stay out of the way so that I don't have another tripod kind of like hanging out there. This song's a bit hard. Let me know if the music is too loud by any chance. You understand? I have it down low, so just let me know, and I'll make sure make sure that it's all good. All right, we have Dan in the house saying hello. Jeremy's also here. All right, I think this is the same one. He might have just switched accounts. And yes, oh, these comments are so big right now. I just realized. All right, like Mr. Moderator is saying, thank you for that information, Paul. He's saying, if you got a question for me, right? Let me get back to this. Please put a Q colon. There we go. Please put a Q colon in front of it. It should look like this. Otherwise, it's just a comment. That's because we have such a active community here within the chat. So if you do have any questions throughout today's lessons about anything at all, please be sure to put a Q colon. And once I get to the Q&A at the end, I'll be able to address that with the power of Ecamm and the search bar that's right here in front of me in the comments window. So that's one of the many reasons why I absolutely love using this program. We have Jeff in the house as well saying hello. Tatiana is here saying hello as well. And everyone telling me that the music's okay. All right, perfect. So now we're just going to go ahead and get into it. Lala's in the house as well. All right, so we're ready to rock and roll. All right. Oh, this is the scene. first thing, shutter speed versus shutter angle. Most people have never even heard the term shutter angle. It's mostly delegated to cinema cameras, but now as we're getting like more and more advanced hybrid cameras that we're gonna get into in tomorrow's lesson about all the different types of cameras, there are some that are actually what we call hybrid cameras, which are traditional DSLR or mirrorless cameras, something like this. And that has the ability to record both photography and video and have the hybrid system between them. Some newer cameras like the Canon oh man, I'm running a blank on the number what it was, but it's their cinema kind of hybrid camera. I think it's C30, but I digress. That camera actually has a toggle switch so that when you put it into a cinema mode, it actually totally converts the entire functionality into a cinema camera, which is where you would find the term shutter angle. And as Google will describe it, or give you the information, it says shutter angle is used to describe the shutter speed relative to the camera's frame rate, which is a really cool advantage to cinema cameras when it comes to this, because it allows you to jump from different frame rates, from 24p to like 30p, 60, 120, and you're still going to maintain the same motion blur, right? And the motion blur is how we naturally see like images in our day-to-day. The motion blur is basically you waving your hand in front of your face, and the lack of complete clarity and the motion and the blur that you see within your hand is what we try to mimic as closely as possible with our videography, so that we can have a natural looking image. When you don't get these parameters correct, that's when images start looking jittery and a bit choppy, because either there's too many frames per second or too few frames per second, either creating a jitter effect or a blur effect, kind of a ghostly image, something that's streaking across your screen, which understanding these things can give a lot of room for creative liberties when creating films and different effects that you're trying to create. But this is basically it. It's shutter speed is how you control exposure and motion blur in your image and hybrid cameras. Now I forgot to put my overhead shot, so what I'm going to do on the fly is I'm going to create one. So I'm going to duplicate this shot and I'm going to go overhead, because I'm going to use my overhead camera to demonstrate this easiest, because it's the one that I have the controls most easily accessible. Okay, so now that I have that, I'm going to shut this off for this scene. And this is also the power of Ecamm, how easy it is for me to just recreate a scene and change it up instantaneously. So right here, I'm going to go and I'm going to change this to camera C. Oop, no, that wasn't it. Camera D. There we go. All right. Now let's flop this around. Boom. There we go. All right. And now we have an overhead shot. Perfect. All with the power of Ecamm. And one thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy this, paste that, and change this to overhead. Perfection. There we go. All right. So now I have the ability to switch from here to here, and we're good to go. Oh, thank you, Daryl, for giving me the information. It was the C70. And yes, the C70 is the cinema camera that has that dual operating system built in. Thank you for that. All right. Now that we're here, let's go back to where we were. Okay. Shutter speed is how to control your exposure and motion blur. Right now, I'm going to give you a demonstration of the motion blur, which is with the overhead camera. Right here, as I move my hand across, I have a natural kind of blur to the image because I have frequency matched, so to speak, the shutter speed to the frame rate. So the frame rate that I'm using on this camera is 30 frames per second, and for that, the shutter angle, and in an angle, let me explain this correctly. When it comes to shutter angle, what it's actually talking about is a type of exposure that the camera will allow. And this really goes back into the days of film photography and film videography, right? Right now, we're using digital cameras and we're trying to kind of reverse engineer what we've already established with film. But the shutter angle was actually the length of time that your shutter would actually stay open in a series of angles being 360 degrees, kind of like in a circular pattern. So a 180 is half of the 360, and that 360 is actually the full range of the shutter being open completely. But if you're using only 180 of that whole 360 circumference, you're only having the shutter open half of the time. So you're getting half speed exposure, meaning that if you were using 24 frames a second on your camera at a 180 degree shutter angle, your camera shutter speed would automatically be 1/50th of a second, or actually 1/48th of a second, because it will double the frame rate to actually get proper exposure. Now, if that same camera at 180 degrees was shooting at 30 degrees or 30 frames a second, then it will automatically bump up the shutter speed to 60 or 1/60th of a second, meaning that it will be doubling the amount of frames that you're requiring the camera to produce. And the reason why it was used like this in those cameras was because nothing was digital and everything was mechanical. So it was actual levers that were turning and burning, so to speak, inside of these cameras, giving proper exposure to the film so that they can get everything done correctly. And it's a lot to take in. That's why I kind of had to dedicate an entire lesson to really bringing down the understanding of what the shutter speed and shutter angle is. But this will come into play when it comes to the exposure triangle, and why that it matters how long, like I had mentioned in the previous lessons, that your shutter's open, like how much time in a fraction of a second you're allowing the exposure to come through. So if I go to my overhead camera here, right now I have it set to that 1/60th of a second, which is the same as a 180 degree shutter angle on the 30 frames per second camera right now, which is giving me adequate blur. But if at the same time I were to take that, no, that's the f-stop, and now I'm going to decrease. Right now I'm at a 1:1, so this would be a what we call a 360 degree shutter, which is, now you can see a little bit more of a ghostly image because I'm requiring the shutter to stay open for longer. Instead of it being 1/60th, or actually cutting each second into 60 frames, I'm actually requiring it right now to only do 30. And if I were to drop that down even lower, like right now to 15 frames per second, you can see the even more ghostly effect that you would get onto this. Now, if you were to be using this as your main shot, you can see how unpleasing and unsettling it would be. And the lower you go with the like kind of the shutter speed, you will see that you're reducing the amount of frames that you could actually produce via the camera, even though right now the live stream is producing 30 frames per second, but the camera doesn't have that to produce, so it's only using what it has at its disposal, and your shutter speed could greatly determine how your image looks. But at the same time, we can drag that shutter speed way too high, and now I'm at 250th of a second, and we can see how it looks hyper realistic on my hand because we have an excess of frames, but we've also added a lot of noise, and what we're seeing right here on the keyboard being the flicker rate in full glory, so to speak, because you're seeing exactly what happens with LEDs and a lot of RGB systems when you're not controlling your shutter rate correctly. All right, so let's bring this back to something manageable. And with that demonstration, we're gonna move on because that is just the scratching of the surface. All right, motion blur, which is what I had just demonstrated there, right, is a long exposure photography technique that allows you to convey the feeling of movement and action in a still image. That is correct in a still image, but like I just demonstrated, when it comes to videography, you kind of don't want to have too much of a draggy, you know, like long exposure type of frequency with your image, and you want it to be synchronized so that you can get the most natural type movement within your video. Okay, so motion blur is a synchronization of frame rate, shutter speed achieved at its most pleasing realistic motion in your image. So that goes right back to shutter angle. Shutter angle at the time of building the cinema cameras could have been even an easier way of understanding to kind of just set it and forget it, which is why a lot of people gravitate to videography or cinema type cameras. But when it comes to the hybrid cameras that we're dealing now, we just need to have a bit of understanding of how the shutter angle relates to the shutter speed. So in the quick reference guide that was given through email, it just basically gives you the basic like go-to settings if you have trouble understanding this, but this is, you know, trying to break it into a way for the novice to understand. I think that just getting a good understanding of what you're trying to achieve within your shot is the way that you should start looking at it. Now, if you're looking to get a more cinematic look, which is the 24 frames a second, then you're probably going to be setting your camera to 1/50th of in shutter speed, because once again is the closest thing that we can get to a shutter angle. And if you were to double 24, you would get 48, and 1/50th would be the closest thing that you can get as far as a shutter speed in these hybrid cameras to represent your shutter angle to get the most pleasing motion blur in your imagery. So now if you were to be using 30 frames a second, that shutter speed will go to 1/60th of a second. And if you were to be using 60 frames a second, which some people like, I don't recommend, but if that would be what you want, then you would also be looking at increasing your shutter speed to 1/20th of a shutter speed, 1/20th of a second, so that you could maintain that natural motion blur. But that also depends on the image that you're going to be doing, because if you're not tracking something that has a lot of motion, like for example, if you are just doing a talking head situation like this, you can kind of bend those rules a bit because of the simple fact that you're not going to have a lot of motion in your shot. So if you were to need to do that to mitigate other things that we're going to be talking about a little bit later, then you'll be able to kind of bend the rules to your advantage. All right, exposure control. Now, going back from the earlier lessons, exposure is basically everything that the be all and end all of everything when it comes to your imagery. Now, you're trying to get appropriate lighting, which we've talked about before, and the exposure is controlled through your camera and what it sees. So, to get the most even lit and controlled light, exposure control is as a visual representation of the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So, how does the exposure triangle actually work? Well, let's get into it. Because we're gonna do controlling your highlights and your shadows is basically the what you're trying to do with your exposure, right? And in controlling it. The exposure triangle is having the understanding of your ISO, which we referenced before, being the sensitivity of your sensor and what you could actually render out, and balancing the lowest ISO value to get the cleanest image instead of increasing it in sensitivity to get an image out, which will then add that digital noise into your image. I forgot how we used to reference it in photography, so I just went there. Grain, that was the term. Yeah, so the grain and the digital noise is what we're trying to limit when we're trying to keep our ISO values at its lowest, because that's directly correlated to the sensor. Now, the shutter speed is how long you're allowing each frame, so to speak, to be rendered or being exposed to light itself to render that image. Now, like I had just mentioned, if you were to decrease the amount of value in your shutter speed, you're actually allowing a longer duration of time, so that will allow more light to come in. So, for example, if you want to keep your ISO at a low value to decrease noise, right, or the grain, then you would want to increase the amount of shutters or shutter time available, trying to keep that at its lowest. At the same time, you're going to need to deal with your aperture, which I had mentioned before, really doesn't get corresponded on the back of your back of your camera as aperture itself, but your f-stop. And your f-stop is the value of how much light your lens is allowing into the sensor, so that the other two aspects of the pyramid, being the shutter speed and the ISO, can kind of balance out to get you the cleanest and best image possible. And that's where they're all constantly enforcing on each other, so to speak, and having to have the perfect balance between the three of them is what's going to get you the best image. Because if you so happen to have an f8 lens, like I had mentioned before, that is not going to allow a lot of light in. So if your lens is your limitation, then you're going to need to boost up the other two aspects, being your shutter speed and your ISO, to allow you to capture as much light as possible so that you can get the cleanest image. But at the same time, if you have a very fast lens, right, something of a f1.4, f2 variety, that will give you the ability to open up the aperture at its widest, and that will flood the sensor with a lot of extra light, giving you the ability to control and actually mitigate, because now you will be running into a problem of overexposure, right? That you have too much light, and you have the ability to shut down your aperture, but the more light the better, because you're able to actually keep your ISO values low and then keep your shutter speed adequate to your frame rate to get the most natural motion blur, and still have the ability to render your image and your colors correctly. Now, If you guys do have questions, please put a Q colon in front of it, because I know I'm just kind of just blazing through a lot of information. And if there's something that you're, like having trouble with, I will do my best to come around back to it. But we will continue. Now, I've mentioned frame rate, right? Frame rate, if you were to Google it, is a measure of how quickly the number of frames appear within a second. So to give a layman's term of frame rate is how many pictures, right? How many JPEGs are you asking your equipment to take of you within the allotted time of 1 second? So every second, 24 frames, FPS, right? Frames per second. If that's the setting that you have on your camera, that means that every second you're creating 24 JPEGs simultaneously, and the one back to that will be another 24. So you'll be going 24, 48, and so on and so on until infinity, because that is what you'll be recording, ingest into your memory card or capture device of choice. So at that same time, you're slicing up the second into 24 individual segments. That is FPS, frames per second. How many frames of imagery are you capturing at that moment? Is this the correct one? Yes. Okay, that's the correct button. Now you have a variety of different choices with these cameras. You have 24p, 30p, in 4K. That's what I would recommend. Like I said, if you have the ability to do 60p, that's usually found in 1080 HD, and I wouldn't recommend it. But your frames per second is exactly that. How many frames do you want your device to capture? And 120p, 240p, I kind of say that that's basically just delegated to slow motion and not really used in a streaming type of environment. That is if you purposely want to capture something of high detail and slow it down, maybe even 4 times, 8 times over to capture it in full glory. But what you're mostly dealing with is going to be 24 or 30 frames per second, and at that moment, I think that you'd be just in line to actually get just your frame rate of choice and start working your system from there, kind of like reverse engineering, because a lot of people prefer 24 frames per second. I do everything in 30 frames per second because that's my own personal choice. And that'll be another conversation for Discord for another day. So I'm not even going to get into it. So, all right. And that's basically what your frame rate is in your camera. It is how many pictures per second do you want to actually export out of it. So the reason why that's important, and just to touch base on it, is the fact that your frame rate is what your camera is going to be producing out as your imagery while you're recording or while you're streaming. The actual amount of frames that you will be displaying really goes back to your shutter speed, because if you're bringing down your shutter speed down something very extremely low that will once again create that motion blur, what actually ends up happening is that even though your camera is producing the imagery out, it is producing the same amount of frames because you're only limiting it to 15, 30, or however few you have set your frame rate or your shutter speed to. So let me correct myself. Your frame rate is still subject to your shutter speed, because if you don't have that correctly synchronized, then your frame rate could only produce what you give it. It will only pump out the amount of frames that you've set your shutter speed to. Okay. And when you encompass all of these things, you might endure something called flicker. Now, the reason why is because of a mismatch between frequency of the light source and the frame rate of your camera, which was what we just mentioned. Now, a lot of people prefer to use 24 frames a second because they feel that it gives them a bit easier. Whoa. Sorry, that was just Aiden. It feels that they give them a bit easier or less issues with flicker. And it might be so because of the simple fact of the frequency matching. The flicker rate is, let me see if I can give another example. Actually, I'm not set up for it. I did that yesterday. The flicker rate is, well, actually, you know what? I can. Let's go back to that light over here. And there we go. Flicker rate is something that we're dealing with because of the lighting sources that we have available to us. It can occur in a variety of different devices, whether it be LCD screens, CRT screens, and if I were to go back to my overhead, even like LEDs and RGB lights in the back. Oh, let's go back to that. Okay, so right there, this is a perfect example of flicker rate. Now, this is an RGB keyboard, right? Red, blue, green, or red, green, blue, however it is, but it's a multicolored keyboard, and what it does is that it has a variety of LED lights, and that should give you a full spectrum of all of the colors. Now, as you see it flicker through the screen, you're not really paying attention, but what it's doing is that it's changing colors at all times. And because of that constant change, you're actually able to see the frequency rate behind it. And the reason why you're able to see it is because in North America, we actually use 60 hertz. No. Oh, whoa. There we go. We actually use 60 hertz as our frequency range. Now, other parts of the earth use 50 hertz, so to speak, and I believe that's the PAL versus the NTSC, depending on their power source. But because we're actually using 60 hertz, it kind of falls right in line with our electronics and why we use the 60 frames per second, and that actually creates that effect of you seeing a mismatch between the light frequency and what your camera picks up. Now, depending on the frame rate and that you have set up in your camera, that and the shutter speed, you will get this effect in the background on certain lights, and those come from a particular set of light sources, right? Those flicker sources is what we're basically dealing with, and it has to do with the new type of lighting that we're dealing with in today's day and age. Basically everything that you can find is LEDs, right? LED light panels. The lights that you get for your home now are LED. Very few that you can find in fluorescent lighting, so to speak, because the entire push is to LED because of its like energy efficiencies, right? An LED, what it actually stands for is light emitting diode, and what it is just basically a tiny light source that gives an indication of light whenever electricity passes through it, which is why we actually get flicker, because the LED inside of this bulbs right here is just indicating that at 60 times a second electricity is passing through it and it gives a glow. The only thing is that our natural eyes actually do not pick up on this, and we see a steady source of light. We don't see the constant off and on that happens because our eyes run closer to like 30 frames per second, so to speak. So the 30 frames per second, in that sense, if you were to set your your shutter speed to 30 frames per second, even though it wouldn't give you the most natural motion blur, it will actually remove the flicker because it will give you a more true to your eye type of visualization of the light source itself. And that's kind of doing the same thing that we would do with the shutter speed, but to the light itself. And that's kind of one technique that you can use to actually mitigate this, right? Because you're trying to remove this at all costs. Like I demonstrated before, this happens on RGB lighting like keyboards and mouse, and a lot of times on cell phone screens, right? Like your smartphone will definitely be able to kind of like give off a certain amount of like frequency response for it. And a lot of times people are constantly thinking, like, I don't know if you've seen it, that they're saying like, oh, the camera's on and is watching me whenever they record one phone with another, because they're seeing a light flicker on the top, and that's just like the front facing camera sensors or the LiDAR sensors that these phones have, that is being displayed through the imagery because that sensor is able to pick it up even though our natural eyes don't. And that's basically the same thing that's happening here. Now, some of the ways to like mitigate the flicker that you would receive in some of the lights is, right, identify and remove. If you can see that this is causing an issue and there's no other way, like, you can just get rid of that light and change it completely. But at the same time, actually, let's go back to blue. Boom. Right? If you have the ability to, like, let's say that's what you have to use, then that's when you would rely into kind of like the frequency matching. So I'm going to try to go to my overhead again, right? And right here, we're doing the 60 frames per second as far as the shutter speed goes, right? The 1/60th. And that's what's giving us this motion blur. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that to 30. And now that we're at like the 30 frames, or basically 1:1, right here, the motion blur changes completely, right? But as you can see, we no longer have a flicker effect. The reason why is because there's more frames of light within the frequency here, and I've cut them down, so now I have double the amount of frequency range within the LED light because it is maxed out at its 60 hertz. But I've cut the camera's shutter speed to half of what it should be. And what it does is that it allows more light to be rendered at a slower speed, giving us more of the effect of our natural eye where we no longer see flicker. Now, if I were to do that with the front facing camera, then all the lights in the background, at no matter what like dim level I'll be able to have it, it would actually render out the image correctly, except that you would cause an overexposure of the rest of your image and a lack of natural motion blur because you're doing that. But these are ways that you can mitigate, or kind of like, let me make sure here. This is, yes. Okay. I've lost control of my stream deck. So that's what we would call the frequency matching, right? Which is basically taking the hertz rate that you're doing there and synchronizing it with your shutter speed, which is not the best, but it is a technique that is possible to use if that's the like worst case scenario. Now, flicker reduction has to do with exactly the same thing, right? It's like frequency matching, but one way that I tend to do it as well is like I shoot at 30 frames per second. So instead of having it at 1/50th of a second, I actually just slow it down a tad, and I really do mean a tad. I put it at 1/50th of a second because what it does is that it creates the same type of prolonged effect in the background, exposing more of the light, so you're reducing the flicker by slowing down the shutter speed or shutter angle, and it still gives me a pleasant enough like motion blur, so that, because basically it's taking the frequency of the 24 frames a second and applying it to the 30 frames per second feed. And that's just one simple trick that I wanted to like put into there, and that's why I put know the rules so that you can break them. Once you have an understanding of the exposure triangle and how the three work together, then you'll start to understand exactly how to avoid and mitigate like flicker sources. Like I mentioned, if you can't remove them and that's what you're dealing with, because let's say you're recording at a particular event, these are some things that you can do to try to address them and work around them. Now, there are a lot of new cameras right now that have a variety of fractional shutter speeds, right? Like instead of being 1/24th or 1/50th, they have a 149.75, because they're really trying to get the camera to render out an image at a completely different frequency, so that it will remove all the flickering and shutter and flicker rate and like banding that could happen in your images. To give you an example, the last People of Video that we went to, I decided to give free portrait shots to everyone, and what I did was I forgot to take my digital shutter off. So I had a silent shutter on my camera, and what that does is that it takes the mechanical shutter and just waves it bye-bye. And when you're using the electronic shutter only, then even though you're doing photography, it really starts acting just like your iPhone or your digital camera, because there's no physical shutter to control the exposure of light, and we're asking the camera to do it completely. And I have had a lot of fun trying to fix those images in post-production, because there's lights and banding everywhere through, like, because every light in the venue was LED, and that's what we have to deal with nowadays. Now, if you're once again within your studio, I recommend going with the best light source possible, right? And if you have that choice, is why we mentioned a dedicated video light. And to bring that back into perspective, a dedicated video light does not deal with these frequencies. Now, it gains power from 60 hertz and the power source that is given, but what it does is that it's creating a constant output. So if you were to try to put it into the hertz range, it's running basically at 1,000 hertz, and it's giving constant amount of light, so that no matter what shutter speed, shutter angle, or frequency your camera might be in, you're still going to get proper exposure, and you're not going to have to deal with banding, flickering, or any of those types of situations, which is why the dedicated video lights would be my recommendation if that's what you can do. But if you're out and about, if you're doing an event, you're in a hotel lobby, a variety of different scenarios, you're going to need to understand this relationship so that you can get the best imagery with avoiding flicker. Because another flicker source, right, to bring it up, that you can find is when you go outdoors and you allow your camera to be in auto mode, right? So let me see here. Synchronization. Achieving proper synchronization between camera's frame rate and the light's frequency. We kind of covered that, but this is the point that I wanted to bring up. The neutral density filters can help correct exposure and synchronization in mixed lighting environments. So mixed lighting is like, let's say we're at an event and you're going to do something outside. Now, if you have your camera set to automatic mode in any way, shape, or form, what's going to happen is that to get correct exposure, it doesn't know it doesn't know what to do, so it's going to take everything out of whack. And a lot of times what these cameras do is that they increase the shutter speed, right, which would be the shutter angle, to a ridiculous amount, creating a lot of jitter and like uneasiness in your videos because it's trying to get proper exposure. And the reason why it's doing that is because the least amount that the shutter is open, being the faster it is, the less of a fraction of a second it's allowing light to be processed. At that time, you're allowing your camera to get correct exposure using the lack of light through the shutter speed. But at those high speeds, it tends to create that jitter that I had shown before, that's like very unpleasing. And that's not what you would want to have, because as soon as you reach those higher shutter speeds, everything basically available to you is going to have a flicker rate. Every non-natural light when you're outdoors is going to basically turn into what I demonstrated in the background with the banding and the flicker, because its frequency is going to be a lot less running at 60 hertz than what you're asking your camera to do because of the high shutter speed. It will bring it up to life. So to handle that using the previous techniques and everything like that, one thing that you can use is a neutral density filter, which is just basically like a sunglasses for your lens, right? And just like you would use sunglasses for yourself outdoors, that's the highest case scenario that you would be using this to mitigate flicker in mixed lighting environments. Because you could be outdoors in like in what we call blue hour, where it's just before, and you're gonna have a variety of lights creating light in your ambiance. And if that's what you're dealing with at the moment, then you're going to be dealing with both the natural and that unnatural flickering light. And having the ability to control it and understand why it's happening is basically like the name of the game. If you can really grasp that concept of the shutter speed has to do with the amount of light, and the frame rate doesn't change because of it, but it affects the image like hand in hand, then you're going to be in a much better situation to kind of avoid it, or mitigate it, because that's basically what we're trying to learn here, how to get the best imagery possible. Now, this was a lot of information, and I know that there was a lot of stuff that I left out because I'm just trying to condense as much as possible. And even dedicating an entire day to like an entire lesson to the frame rates and flicker rates and how to mitigate it, I know for a fact that there's got to be a bunch of questions. So I'm going to go right now to the Q&A. If you have a question that want me to address or clarify as best as possible, please put a Q colon in front of it so that I can search for it, as I am doing right now. Okay. Right now, all I see is one question. So let me make sure. Yep. Right now, all I see is one question from David. All right, let me put this up here. Is it still recommended to have ISO to be twice the shutter speed? Well, you see, that's like the ISO is not related to the shutter speed. So hopefully like the title really didn't confuse everyone, because your ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor, right? The only thing that value is going to change is the overall exposure of your image and how much noise or grain is going to be applied to it. So changing your ISO value is only going to be how sensitive the sensor is to the light that you're gonna admit onto it. Now, if at that same time, right, your ISO is cranked up really high because you're not giving it a lot of light to work with, it's going to introduce a lot of noise, a lot of digital artifacting, which is what we're trying to avoid, right? We're trying to get the best, cleanest image. So it's always trying to play this balancing game of the exposure triangle to keep all points as low as possible. And when I say low as possible, meaning the aperture at its lowest point possible, so to speak, by still being, you know, sharp, and giving the most amount of light so that the ISO doesn't have to be cranked up, so that it doesn't add artifacting, and then having the shutter speed at the appropriate angle, so to speak, at the appropriate rate, so that it will give you the most natural motion blur. And Paul was just saying, like, he probably meant like shutter. Well, hopefully that answered it either way. Dan also has a question. It says, I'm trying to process all of this. How much will flicker rate be visible to the average person? How much time should be spent perfecting it? Well, the only reason why is because there was a lot of people who were saying that I'm having problems with this myself. So going back to it, one of the things that causes flicker is televisions, right? And there's a lot of people who want to put a television behind them, and they're not understanding why they're seeing like black bars going past their image constantly. And that has to do with the synchronization, the frequency matching, your shutter speed, and your frame rate. All of those things are encompassing into what you're producing as your image. Now, your ISO is the sensitivity or the brightness, and that could be played with kind of just with your aperture and your lens. But let's not go into that. We're talking about seeing the banding in like lights, imagery, colors, and a bunch of different distracting artifacts and elements that you can find, because we're not all using dedicated Hollywood video lights, right? And it's whether it's photography or videography, you could be finding yourself in a variety of different scenarios with mixed lighting. And what I'm trying to convey here is to give you an understanding that if you do see this in your imagery, how to handle it. Now, right off the bat, if you don't see it, then it's not an issue. But there's a lot of people who have dealt with this, and that's why I brought this up as a main area of concern, because a lot of people are dealing with this and do not understand why. In a nutshell, if you can replace the lights and have a completely video dedicated light, whether that's Ulanzi, Aperture, Nan lights, or any type, JVM, right? Great video maker. There's a variety of them, but if they are dedicated video lights, then the technology within them is already pre-built to avoid the frequencies that cause flicker. So at the same time, if you have that capability to do up your studio, then that's not a beginner aspect, because you're doing much better than just a beginner, so to speak. And it's for the novice who's trying to figure out why the lights in their house that they bought are giving them an issue, and how to mitigate that aspect, how to handle that. So hopefully that's what the information that I was trying to convey for someone who's trying to work with what they have and how to prevent it. Like I said, the first thing is, if you can change them out for dedicated lights, more power to you. That would be the easiest thing, and then you don't have to worry about, and you can set the other settings to your liking. But these are just some techniques and some demonstrations and illustrations of what's causing the flickering, the lights, and the reason why LEDs, light emitting diodes, that's what they are. And the other thing being like how to work around them. Like I said, you can bring your shutter speed down to even like 1:1, just be like 1/30th of a second at a 30 frames per second. You could even do 1/25th of a second if you're at 24 frames a second, to try to match the shutter speed with the frequent with your frame rate as close as possible, so that you're basically creating the brightest image, or something as close to the human eye as possible. And that will remove a lot of the flickering and banding and all that stuff, but it would come at the sacrifice of motion blur, and it seeming a little bit ghostly because of the fact that the frequency is off in hopes to remove the banding, but then creates another issue along the line. At that point, is like pick your poison. Question, it says, do you recommend locking in the shutter speed for video and adjusting the other two, aperture and ISO, when using ND filters, and different than I'm still? I think I got that correct. But yes, that's what I would actually recommend, because the shutter speed is what's going to give you the most realistic motion blur, or the most realistic video. Because motion blur is the term that's mostly used when it comes to photography, but in videography you kind of just don't mention it in the same aspect, because you're constantly seeing images. You either say like, oh, it looks like it's dragging, or it looks like extra sharp. But when you nail it right, people don't even notice it at all. So when it comes to that, is why I mentioned as like the last thing being to try out neutral density filters, right? Because that will allow you to once again put a darkness filter over your lens to correct exposure. Why is this important? Because when you lock in your shutter speed, right, you're locking in for the best motion in the video, right? So if you're shooting at 30 frames per second and you go 1/60th of a second, when you have a even at an f4, right, at an f4 lens or something even faster that's allowing a lot of light into it, what you will notice immediately is that your video is overexposed, that there's too much light coming in, because you're locking it down to that shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. So at that time, you're basically required to throw in that dark ND filter onto it. And once you get the exposure correct, you're all set, because now you know that you can record with a properly exposed image. It is at the appropriate frame rate and shutter speed to synchronize correctly to get the best motion blur. And that best motion blur is what's going to prevent a lot of the flickering and a lot of the other issues that you're going to be dealing with in mixed lighting environments, shooting outdoor, indoor, and vice versa. So locking down that is what you're going to be looking for. So thank you for that question. I think that kind of also helped maybe put all the things that I was trying to say into perspective, because locking that down correctly is what you're gonna see is gonna overexpose the other aspects, which is why you would need to use the neutral density filter. Okay. Says, I apologize if I missed, but the only way I've been able to avoid banding in my Sony a6400 is to keep my cheap LED lights at full power, and you're saying to avoid this buying real lights. Well, that's what I said. Now, if you can, yeah, because just like it says video like dad, just like you, that's the same lights that I'm dealing with back here, right? Like, I don't have the budget right now to replace every single light in my studio here with a dedicated video light. I think Aperture creates like motivation lights, basically light bulbs that have the traditional like socket that are all dedicated video lights, but they're expensive, and to replace everything with that, um, it might not be feasible for everyone. And that's why I said, as a novice, as a beginner, even someone like me, I'm still working with I got. So right there, I'm still using that video light at 100%, and you understanding the limitation to avoid it is the same thing. So the only way to like try to get a light that doesn't work at 100% is to get a dedicated video light. So it might not be within your budget, but it would be the only way to kind of address that correctly. My earlier question was referencing field video, not studio. Exactly. So exactly, if you're outside, because that's the whole thing, within studios, everything's going to be a lot darker, so you'll be able to control your dynamic range a lot better, right? You'll be able to control your highlights and your shadows and get a pretty overall even lit exposed image within a studio, which is why we recommend always having your lights and being able to control them. That is the best case scenario, but not always we're dealing with the best case scenario. So if you are in an outdoor environment, you're covering an outdoor event, different things like that. I know that I wanted to shoot some video of my car, right? And I wanted to do the tail lights, right? Because I got some new, what do they call those, rain flashing tail lights, right? But whenever I wanted to do a video, all I'm getting is the frequency banding of the LED lights that I have just installed. So I had to adjust my shutter speed to match my frame rate. And once I did that and did that correctly, the image was extremely bright, overexposed, which required me to then put the neutral density filter to correct exposure, and then having the synchronization of the frame rate and shutter speed correct. I didn't have any of the banding issues, and I was able to record the video that I wanted to do based around my taillights without having any issues. And that's a perfect example of why you would need to get that correct, because if not, then it's going to create the banding, the ugly imagery, even though you're trying to demonstrate what the light is doing, you know, outdoors. And in my scenario, my taillights. Says, do I understand that you're saying that it's okay to use an ND filter indoors, bringing my cheap LED to full power and then lower the aperture? Yeah. If that's what you're dealing with, then yeah, absolutely. Because if that's the way that you can control and use that light, then I don't see a reason why not. At the end of the day, you're controlling exposure, and ND filters are not only for outdoors. Right? Because if that was the scenario that I was dealing with, now the only other thing that I would like to mention about that is that make sure that it's comfortable for you, right? Not having to say like, oh, I'm gonna use this light at 100%, but then it's blasting me in my face, and now I'm like blinded to everything else that I'm doing while I'm trying to record a video, because that just doesn't make any sense. At that point, I would look for another creative way to maybe do so. But at the same time, you could put your video light at 100%, and then you can use a form of diffusion in front of it, right? So that you can soften that light. And then if at the same time you're still overexposed, you have the ability to use ND filters. Yeah, that's what in my eye, that's what really differentiates one of these hybrid cameras to the new digital cinema cameras today, is that the cinema cameras have that natural digital built-in ND filter that will adjust the exposure no matter what you're shooting at any time. So David has a question. Do I recommend Philips Hue lights? Not at all. Those are gonna flicker on you, and then they're also like, their quality control has really not been the best. But at that time, I don't recommend it. Just like if I had the ability to go over, I probably wouldn't even use what I have myself, right? Which are these Amazon lights, because I'm in the same scenario as Video Like Dad, saying that I have to use them at 100%. If they're not at 100%, they're gonna create that flicker and that banding effect, which is why I said I'm firsthand letting you know exactly how it is. And this dedicated video light here is basically the best thing, because no matter what frequency or frame rate that I'm using, this is gonna overpower it and give me the most consistent light overall. So slowly but surely, I'll probably be ending up replacing every other light here with a dedicated video light. But at the time being, you work with what you got, and if this is what you're dealing with to start off, then I highly recommend just, you know, working with what you got starting right now, and have the knowledge of what you're looking for in the future, so that you can purchase the correct things when you actually have the budget for it, instead of just like buying things that at the end of the day aren't gonna do, you know, what you want, and then have already spent the money on something that you might not be able to return. So okay, I think we did it. I don't see any more questions here. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to hit the like button. It's highly appreciated. But now I'm going to go back here and just double check, get out of this here. All right, so says Hue. You see the Hue lights. He's confirming with me. Jeremy saying Hue lights big time flicker, especially at low power. Yeah, and if that's exactly what you're dealing with, you know, as far as it, I wouldn't recommend it. Like, yeah, I just wouldn't. There are some lights right now, and I would even recommend that if you're looking at some, I would just maybe buy one or two and then test it out before I go ahead and just buy the whole thing, because that's still what I did, right, to see if I can manage with what I had as my production. But then at the end of the day, there's a variety of different options. I chose this because it was also ease of use, as far as that I have an application which turns them all on and turns them all off. But at the same time, if you have the ability to like get a variety of different lights, like this one right here, this light right here that's casting this pink blue thing, half C curve thing right there, that's just a simple little like accessory light, right? And it's able to project that light. I think it costs $20, and something as simple as that, that's still dedicated for video, is not going to cause flicker, but it will still be able to like create motivation and a variety of different lights. Now, I wouldn't recommend that to be like my key light or anything like that, but at the same time, it could do a lot for just sprucing up, you know, your background and adding a splash of color out there. So all right, everyone. I think that's it. Thank you, as always, for hanging out here with me. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about cameras, different camera types, and lens types. So I'm really going to have a lot of fun doing that. And bring your questions, because I'm just going to go ham on it, so to speak. I'm going to try to have the longest Q&A section. So like, you know, any questions that you guys might have that I think that I might not have covered, so to speak, I really want you to bring that to me, because I'm just gonna have like as many lenses as possible to try to demonstrate and show you exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to these amazing devices. So that will be day 4 tomorrow, which will be cameras and lenses. And then day 5 Friday, I'm just giving you a little like precursor. I think I'm just gonna like start from scratch, right? Because it's gonna be about building the look and feel of the broadcast. So I think I'm gonna basically just create a new scene at the end of lesson 5, so to speak, and we're gonna build a new look and feel to what I'm doing right now. And you guys are gonna have, like, the say, you guys are gonna choose what colors we're gonna go with and how we're gonna do it. So it'll be the best demonstration of how we can put all of these things together to create the look and feel of your shot. And with that being said, I want to thank everyone. Can't wait to see all of your smiling faces tomorrow when we do it all over again. And I will see you here 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we're going to be talking all about cameras and lenses. Have a great day. Talk to you.